The sun had just begun its slow descent over Dry Creek, painting the wooden facades of the town in gold and amber. Dust swirled along the main street, kicked up by the sparse foot traffic of tired ranchers and weary travelers. The air smelled of sagebrush and smoke from distant chimneys, a scent that seemed to cling to the bones of the town like a stubborn memory dot at the edge of town. Standing by the wooden rail of a weathered porch was Evelyn Ward, a striking woman of 30, with copper-streaked hair pulled back in a loose braid and eyes that shimmered with a mixture of sorrow and defiance. She had returned to Dry Creek after years away, drawn back by whispers of trouble, and the small crowd gathered near the general store couldn't take their eyes off her. There was something magnetic about Evelyn, the kind of presence that silenced conversation even when people tried to talk. Leaning against the far corner of the porch was a figure, equally impossible to ignore a tall, broad-shouldered Apache warrior named Tahkeel, his dark, long hair tied loosely behind his head. Bare-chested, adorned with tribal jewelry of bone and turquoise that glinted in the fading sunlight. His eyes, sharp and knowing, scanned the town as if measuring it, every movement deliberate, his presence commanding attention even from those who wished to avoid him. Evelyn's husband, Silas Ward, was a man whose wealth had always outweighed his charm. At 45, he carried himself with an air of entitlement, his fine clothes slightly worn at the edges but still signaling status. His jaw was tight as he watched Evelyn and Tahkeel from across the street, a mixture of unease and simmering rage in his gaze. Silas had always prided himself on control over the town, over his household, but today something felt different. Evelyn stepped forward, her boots clicking against the wooden boards of the porch, and Tahkeel straightened, sensing her movement. The air seemed to hold its breath. With an effortless grace, Evelyn embraced Tahkeel, her arms wrapping around him as if drawing in a lifetime of unspoken words. The crowd gasped collectively, whispers rising like the wind through the sage. Evelyn. Silas's voice was low, rough, but it carried over the distance. His hands clenched into fists, and a shadow of anger crossed his sharp features. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Evelyn pulled back slightly, still close to Tahkeel, her eyes meeting Silas's. There was no fear there, only a haunting mix of truth and resolve. "I'm reminding you, and everyone else, that some debts are not just yours to collect." "Silas," she said softly, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the townsfolk. Tahkeel didn't speak, but his gaze held the weight of centuries, a quiet intensity that made even the bravest men shift in place. The town watched, captivated and fearful, as if they were witnessing the collision of two worlds, one ruled by law and property, the other by honor and a history that demanded respect. Silas's face darkened, his pride wounded more than his patience. He stepped forward, his boots thudding against the boards, but the air seemed to resist him, thick with tension. "You've been gone too long, Evelyn. Don't think I'll let some outsider come here and flaunt whatever nonsense this is." The crowd grew restless. Mothers whispered to daughters, men exchanged uneasy glances, and the saloon doors swung gently in the wind. Tahkeel's expression remained unreadable, but the faint curl of a knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips, as though he anticipated the storm to come. Evelyn turned fully to Silas, her eyes blazing. "This town will remember today, not because of fear, but because of truth." She let go of Tahkeel and stepped back, her hair catching the last rays of the sun. The tension was palpable, like the calm before a desert storm. Silas's nostrils flared, his pride now tangled with anger, his control slipping in front of everyone he thought he ruled. For a moment, the world seemed to stop in Dry Creek. The wind carried the distant howl of a coyote, and the town held its collective breath, watching the unspoken war unfold between Evelyn, her husband, and the man who had quietly become the catalyst for change. And then Silas moved fast, sharp, and decisive. But what he did next would not just mark the night. It would mark the town's history, casting a shadow over Dry Creek that would linger far longer than the sun's final rays. Silas Ward's eyes burned with a mix of fury and disbelief as he stepped forward, boots scraping against the wooden boards of the street. The town of Dry Creek fell silent, the air thick with anticipation and dread. Every man, woman, and even the children peeking from alleyways felt the weight of the moment. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath. Evelyn Ward stepped back from Tahkeel, but her gaze never wavered. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, resolute fire. She had returned to Dry Creek for a reason, and no man's anger, not even her husband's, would deter her. You think you can come here, flaunting your ways, and I will just stand by? Silas shouted, voice cracking under the strain of wounded pride. This town is mine, my family's, and I will not have outsiders corrupting it. Tahkeel's dark eyes glimmered with an unspoken warning. He did not step forward, but his presence alone radiated a power that Silas could not confront with wealth or threats. The Apache warrior's stance was calm, yet every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring, ready to act if necessary. Evelyn walked a step closer to Tahkeel, standing not behind him, but beside him. Silas, you've built walls around your heart and your town. But some truths cannot be fenced in. I didn't return for your approval. I returned because there are debts that must be faced. Her words were soft, but every syllable cut sharper than any blade. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances. Many had known Silas as a man of influence and wealth, yet here he was, exposed in front of everyone, humiliated not by an enemy from another town, but by the woman he had married and the man she embraced. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Do you really intend to strike her? One old rancher muttered, voice trembling. In front of us all? Silas's hands trembled slightly, the anger mixing with a deep, raw fear. This wasn't just about pride, it was about control. Everything he had built, every whispered deal, every deal made in the shadows, suddenly seemed fragile in the face of Evelyn's defiance and Tahkeel's silent strength. I will not be mocked, Silas growled. His hand moved toward the revolver at his hip, the motion slow but deliberate. The crowd recoiled, some reaching for their own weapons, sensing that the calm of the afternoon had shattered irrevocably. Tahkeel's voice finally broke the tension, deep and steady. There is nothing to mock, Silas Ward, only what is right. Step aside and no harm comes to anyone. Resist, and you will learn the consequences. The words were not a threat, not exactly. They were a promise of inevitability. Silas froze, sweat beating at his temples. The faces of the townspeople pressed closer, watching as their usually formidable leader faced a reckoning no one had foreseen. Evelyn stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on Tahkeel's shoulder, a gesture both intimate and public, a declaration that she had chosen where her loyalty lay. It is not too late, Silas. You can step back, walk away, and still preserve what dignity you have left. But pride was a dangerous thing, and Silas had too much of it. With a sudden, violent movement, he drew his revolver and fired not at Tahkeel, but at the ground near them. The sound cracked through the street, sending a flock of crows into the sky. Dust and debris rose from the boards, marking the exact moment the town realized there would be no turning back. The crowd gasped, fear and sorrow washing over them. Mothers clutched their shawls, men shook their heads, and even the stoic barkeep leaned against his counter, grimacing. Silas had just shattered the fragile peace of Dry Creek, and everyone knew the storm had only just begun. Tahkeel's eyes never left Silas. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down and picked up a small stone from the dusty street, holding it loosely in his powerful hand. Enough blood need not be spilled today, he said, voice calm yet commanding. The implication was clear. If Silas chose the path of violence, he would face a force far beyond the townsfolk's imagination. Evelyn's heart raced, but she did not flinch. She had faced danger before, and she knew that Tahkeel's strength was unmatched. Her gaze swept over the town, seeing the sorrow, the fear, and the silent judgment in their eyes. Silas had already lost more than he knew as the sun sank further behind the horizon. Casting long shadows over Dry Creek, the tension remained unresolved. Silas's pride was wounded, Tahkeel's presence unyielding, and Evelyn's choice irreversible. The town watched, waiting for the inevitable, because everyone knew that by morning nothing would be the same again. The air of Dry Creek felt heavier as night began to fall, a thick darkness settling over the wooden buildings like a suffocating blanket. The townsfolk whispered in hushed tones, some retreating into their homes, others standing frozen in the streets, unable to look away. The events of the afternoon had shaken the town to its core. Pride, fear, and anger coalesced into a tension that made even the wind tremble. Silas Ward's hand still hovered near his revolver, but the initial surge of fury was waning, replaced by a creeping doubt. He had expected confrontation, perhaps even victory, but not the quiet, unyielding power that Tahkeel radiated. The Apache warrior's presence was magnetic, commanding, yet calm, a living contradiction that Silas could neither understand nor conquer. Evelyn Ward stayed at Tahkeel's side, her gaze unwavering. There was no fear in her expression, only determination and a strange serenity. Her hair, catching the last streaks of sunset, seemed almost to glow in the encroaching darkness. "Silas," she said softly, her voice carrying across the empty street, "you have to see what you've become. You've let pride blind you to what matters." The crowd held its breath. Even the saloon doors, creaking with the evening breeze, seemed to lean in closer to catch her words. Some of the older townsfolk shook their heads in sorrow. They had known Silas as a man of authority and influence, but never like this, reduced to fear, hesitation, and prideful stubbornness. "You think I'm blind? You think I'll let some outsider, some stranger come here and take what's mine?" Silas barked, his voice raw and trembling. "I built this town. I control it." Tahkeel's gaze did not waver. His jaw tightened slightly, the muscles of his bare chest and arms flexing under the dim light of the lanterns flickering along the street. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threatening move. He only stood there, tall, resolute, a living testament to the strength of a life built on honor and principle. Evelyn reached out and touched Silas's arm, but he flinched, pulling back as if her touch burned. "It's not about control, Silas. It's never been about control. It's about truth, and you can't fight that. You can't own it or suppress it." A murmur ran through the townspeople, some nodding, others shaking their heads in disbelief. They had watched Silas's rise to power, seen his control over their lives, and now they saw it crumble in front of them. The sorrow in the town was palpable, a silent, oppressive weight pressing down on everyone who lived there. Silas's face twisted in anguish, anger, and desperation. He clenched his fists and looked at Tahkeel, then at Evelyn. The world he had known, the world he had believed he controlled, was slipping through his fingers, dissolving like sand through a clenched hand. He wanted to lash out, to assert dominance, but every fiber of his being recognized the futility of such a move. And then, in a sudden, reckless burst of emotion, Silas raised his hand, not toward Tahkeel this time, but to gesture broadly at the townspeople. "You, every one of you. Look at this. Look what she's done to me. She has turned my wife's heart toward an outsider, a stranger." His voice cracked with anguish, shaking the boards beneath him as he shouted. The crowd recoiled, some lowering their heads in sorrow, others murmuring quietly to themselves. The depth of Silas's despair was more terrifying than any gunshot. It was raw, emotional, and undeniable. Families whispered prayers, shopkeepers leaned against walls in disbelief. And even the stoic sheriff of Dry Creek, a man known for keeping order with cold logic, felt a pang of pity and horror. Tahkeel remained silent, his presence a steady anchor against the storm of Silas's pride and sorrow. Evelyn stepped closer to him, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. "Let it go, Silas. There is no victory in this path. Only more sorrow. Only more regret." Silas's chest heaved, and for a long moment the night was silent except for the whispering wind through the dusty street. He lowered his head, shoulders slumping, the fire of his anger dimming into the embers of grief. The townspeople watched in solemn silence, feeling the weight of his surrender not as triumph, but as tragedy. As the lanterns flickered, casting long shadows over the street, Evelyn and Tahkeel remained side by side, a symbol of quiet strength and inevitable change. The town of Dry Creek had witnessed the unraveling of pride, the collision of worlds, and the first tremors of a reckoning that would forever alter the lives of those who called it home. Night fully descended, leaving the wooden buildings draped in darkness, and the sorrow in Dry Creek settled like a thick fog. Tomorrow would bring decisions, consequences, and perhaps the final act of a story that had begun in dust, pride, and the warmth of an embrace that had changed everything. Night had fully swallowed Dry Creek. The once bustling streets were now silent, illuminated only by the flickering glow of lanterns swinging gently in the evening breeze. Shadows stretched long across the dusty boardwalks, and the wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and smoke from distant chimneys. The town had not slept well, and neither had its people. Haunted by the confrontation that had unfolded earlier, Silas Ward sat heavily on the porch of his large wooden house. Shoulders slumped, his revolver resting on his knee like a useless talisman. The anger that had once fueled him had begun to curdle into despair. Pride, once his armor, now felt like a prison he could not escape. The town, too, seemed to sense his unraveling. Even the bravest men who had once saluted his authority now avoided his gaze. Across the street, Tahkeel stood tall, bare-chested and imposing, his long black hair catching the lantern light, his tribal jewelry clinking faintly as he shifted his stance. Evelyn stood close, not hidden but openly by his side, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. Her eyes were steady, full of a calm power that Silas could not match. She had chosen him, and in doing so, she had shifted the balance of the entire town. "You don't understand." "Evelyn," Silas muttered, voice low, almost broken. "Everything I've done, all these years, for this town, for you, it means something." Evelyn shook her head, her braids swinging with emotion. "It means something, yes, but not what you think. Pride and control are not the same as love, Silas. You built walls around your heart and around Dry Creek, and now those walls are cracking." Silas's jaw tightened. He had never been spoken to this way, not by townsfolk, not by rivals, not even by his own father when he had been young. Evelyn's words were a force he could not deflect. His hands, once steady with authority, now shook slightly. He looked out over the street, seeing the faces of the townspeople in shadow. They were watching, waiting, grieving silently at the unraveling of a man they had once revered. Tahkeel's voice finally broke the quiet. Calm, deep, and unwavering, it resonated through the night. "Silas Ward, there is no honor in clinging to pride when it blinds you to the truth. What you seek to control is already beyond your grasp. Accept it or let it consume you." The words hung in the air like a warning. Silas's chest heaved. He had faced danger before, gunfights, rival ranchers, even the harsh desert itself, but nothing had felt like this. He was not fighting a man, nor the woman he loved. He was fighting himself, and in that struggle he was losing. Evelyn stepped closer to Tahkeel, placing her hand firmly on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the cool night air. "We cannot fix your mistakes for you, Silas," she said, "but you can choose to stop making more. Don't let your pride destroy everyone around you. Look at them. The town is already grieving, and it's only the beginning." Silas's eyes filled with tears he refused to shed openly. The realization was too bitter. The man he thought he was, the authority he thought he wielded, the fear he thought inspired, all of it was gone. What remained was vulnerability, sorrow, and the sting of being outmatched not by weapons, but by truth, love, and moral strength. For a long moment, the night was silent except for the occasional creak of boards in the wind and the faint whisper of distant crows. Silas lowered his head, gripping his revolver so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had reached the edge of a precipice, and he knew he had nowhere left to run. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he let the revolver slide from his hands to the boards below. The metallic clang echoed like a funeral bell through the street. The town seemed to exhale collectively, the weight of sorrow and tension hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Tahkeel watched silently, his muscles relaxed but ready, his presence still commanding. Evelyn's gaze softened, though her resolve did not waver. The choice had been made. Silas had faced the truth, even if grudgingly, and the town had witnessed the breaking of his pride. But the night was not over, and consequences rarely arrive quietly. Somewhere in the shadows, behind the walls of the town, whispers of past misdeeds stirred, promising that tomorrow would bring more than just reconciliation. It would bring a reckoning no one in Dry Creek could have anticipated. As the lanterns flickered and the wind carried the scent of sage through the empty streets, Evelyn and Tahkeel remained side by side, symbols of calm authority and inevitable change. Silas sat on his porch, broken, sorrowful, and alone, a man whose pride had been shattered and whose choices would ripple through the town in ways none of them could yet see. The next morning, Dry Creek awoke under a sky of steel-gray clouds, the sun barely cutting through the haze. A restless wind swept across the town, carrying the scent of dust, sagebrush, and tension. The townsfolk emerged cautiously, their eyes drawn to the street where Silas Ward had once wielded control like a weapon. Now, silence lingered like a mourning shroud over every boardwalk and wooden storefront. Evelyn Ward stepped out first, her white dress brushing the dusty boards, her braids swinging with purpose. Beside her, Tahkeel walked with a quiet power that seemed to bend the town's attention toward him. His bare chest gleamed faintly in the pale morning light, the bones and turquoise of his tribal jewelry catching subtle glints as he moved. The townspeople could not help but stare, a mix of awe and unease in their expressions. Silas emerged from his porch, his steps slow, deliberate, and heavy. He did not meet their eyes, his face pale, jaw clenched, hands trembling slightly. He had spent the night wrestling with himself, with the realization that the life he had built on pride and control was crumbling around him. But he was not done yet. His mind churned with one desperate plan. One last attempt to assert the authority he feared had slipped away. The town gathered cautiously in the center of the street, drawn by instinct and curiosity. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some feared a confrontation, some hoped for reconciliation, and others simply wanted to witness the unraveling of a man whose pride had long overshadowed their lives. Silas raised his head suddenly, and his eyes blazed with a dangerous mix of desperation and pride. "You think this town belongs to anyone but me? You think a stranger and a woman can decide its fate?" His voice cracked, echoing against the wooden facades. "I will show you all what it means to betray me." Evelyn's hand moved subtly to Tahkeel's arm, a silent warning. But Tahkeel's expression remained calm, his dark eyes steady, unwavering. He did not draw a weapon, nor did he flinch. His presence alone was a force, unspoken yet undeniable. Then, without warning, Silas raised his revolver. The town gasped, fear gripping every heart. But instead of aiming at Tahkeel, he fired a single shot into the air, a warning, a declaration of intent, a signal that chaos was coming. The townspeople ducked instinctively, hearts pounding. Dust and grit exploded from the boards, the echo ringing like a bell of doom. Tahkeel stepped forward, muscles tense, bare chest flexing with controlled power. "Enough," he said, voice deep, resonant, and commanding. "If you continue down this path, Silas, you will bring ruin to yourself and to everyone here. Do you understand the consequences of defiance?" Silas faltered, his hands shaking, his vision blurring with anger, humiliation, and fear. He had faced guns, storms, and rival men in the past, but this calm, relentless authority embodied in Tahkeel was something he could not fight. He lowered the revolver slowly, his face twisting with frustration and sorrow. Evelyn stepped fully into the street, standing beside Tahkeel, radiating quiet strength. "Silas," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd, "it doesn't have to end in more sorrow. There is a choice here. Walk away from pride. Walk away from fear. Choose life, or this town will grieve the cost of your anger forever." The townspeople whispered among themselves, realizing the truth of her words. Dry Creek had long suffered under Silas's control, and now they were witnessing the potential collapse of a man whose pride had overshadowed reason, mercy, and compassion. Mothers clutched their shawls, men lowered their hats in silent acknowledgement, and even the usually stoic sheriff leaned heavily on his post, grimacing with sorrow. Finally, Silas's shoulders slumped fully. He let the revolver drop to the dusty boards with a metallic clang. The sound rang through the street like a death knell. The town collectively exhaled, the tension breaking slightly, yet leaving a residue of fear and grief that would linger for years. Tahkeel did not smile, but his eyes softened slightly as he turned toward Evelyn. She nodded, a gesture of gratitude and relief. Together, they represented a new order, one built not on fear, wealth, or control, but on strength, courage, and unshakable moral authority. As Silas staggered backward, head bowed, the townsfolk remained silent witnesses to his fall. And somewhere deep in the shadows of Dry Creek, the wind whispered of consequences yet to come, a reckoning that would test every heart in the town, and ensure that no one would ever forget the day pride was broken in the streets. The sky over Dry Creek had darkened to an ominous gray as late afternoon approached. The town seemed caught between two worlds, light fading, shadows lengthening, and a heavy sense of sorrow settling over every boardwalk, every wooden storefront. The events of the morning had left a mark deeper than anyone had anticipated. Silas Ward sat on the steps of his porch, the revolver long since discarded, his face pale and etched with grief. Pride had been stripped from him, leaving only a hollow, trembling man. Evelyn Ward and Tahkeel moved through the town as one, a striking contrast to Silas's collapse. Tahkeel's muscular form, bare chest glinting faintly in the waning light, his long black hair shifting with each step, radiated calm authority. His tribal jewelry clinked faintly, an understated yet powerful reminder of his presence. Evelyn walked beside him, her white dress dust-streaked but pristine in its symbolism, her braid catching the fading sun. Together, they were a living testament to strength, courage, and a quiet moral power that Silas had failed to grasp. The townspeople watched from their porches, behind doors, and at corners. Mothers clutched their shawls, shopkeepers leaned against walls, and the local blacksmith's hammer rested unused as people observed in hushed fear and sorrow. Dry Creek had never seen such a confrontation, nor a man so publicly humbled. The town understood now that the foundation upon which Silas had built his influence, fear and pride, was gone, replaced by something unshakable, truth and honor embodied in Tahkeel. Silas finally lifted his head, eyes hollow but still burning with unspent anguish. He stepped forward slowly, his hands shaking, and addressed the crowd. I thought I could protect this town. I thought my control meant safety. But I see now. I've only brought fear and sorrow. His voice cracked, and several townsfolk gasped softly. They had witnessed strength, cruelty, and authority, but rarely such raw vulnerability. Evelyn's hand found Tahkeel's arm again, and he placed a reassuring hand over hers. "Silas," she said gently, "acknowledging your faults is the first step. You cannot undo the past, but you can choose what comes next. Let this sorrow be a lesson, not a prison." Silas swallowed hard, nodding faintly. But then, unexpectedly, his knees buckled, and he fell to the boards of the street, collapsing into a heap. Gasps spread through the crowd. The man who had once ruled Dry Creek with fear now lay humbled, broken by his own pride and a weight of recognition. Some of the townspeople crossed themselves quietly. Others murmured prayers. It was as if the collective heart of Dry Creek had stopped all at once. In mourning for both the man and the town itself, Tahkeel knelt slightly beside Silas, not in dominance but in presence. His voice was calm, resonant, yet carried weight enough to command attention. "Silas Ward, you may rise again, but you will rise wiser, tempered by the sorrow you have wrought. The town can heal, but only if you accept the lesson fully." Evelyn stepped closer to Silas, her hands lightly touching his shoulders. "You will not be humiliated forever," she said softly. "You will live, you will learn, and you will see that life is not about control. It is about responsibility, honor, and compassion. Dry Creek deserves that much from you, and so do you." The townsfolk remained silent, witnessing the strange reconciliation of power, sorrow, and moral truth. Even those who had feared Silas felt an unfamiliar pity, a recognition that the fall of pride often carried the heaviest cost, not just for the one who falls, but for all who depended on him. Finally Silas rose, shakily, supported by the weight of both his shame and newfound clarity. His face was pale, eyes still haunted, but there was a flicker of resolve. The sorrow in the town remained palpable, but a sense of understanding began to replace fear. People realized that change had come, and with it a hard, unflinching truth. Dry Creek would never be the same again. Tahkeel and Evelyn moved toward the center of the street, standing side by side, silent symbols of strength and moral authority. Silas watched them, a man reborn through the agony of humiliation and sorrow. The town, too, watched, and the lesson was clear. True power did not lie in fear or pride, it lay in courage. Truth and honor died as the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, casting Dry Creek in long, mournful shadows. The town exhaled collectively. Tomorrow promised decisions, reckonings, and resolutions. But tonight, they mourned not just for Silas, but for the innocence, pride, and illusions that had been stripped away in the streets of Dry Creek. The first light of dawn crept over Dry Creek, painting the town in muted gold and gray. The wind carried the scent of dust and sage, weaving through empty streets that had spent the night in uneasy silence. A few townsfolk began to emerge from their homes, hesitant but compelled to witness what would unfold, the final act of a drama that had gripped their hearts for days. Silas Ward stood on the porch of his large wooden home, shoulders slumped but now steady. He had spent the night wrestling with his pride, his sorrow, and the weight of realization. Every action of the past, every moment of arrogance had led to this reckoning. And yet, even in defeat, he could not deny the truth he had been forced to face. Strength and respect were earned through honor, not fear. Tahkeel waited in the middle of the street, muscles taut, bare chest glistening faintly in the early morning light, his long black hair swaying slightly with the breeze. The bones and turquoise of his tribal jewelry caught the sun, each piece a reminder of his heritage and the unshakable authority he embodied. Evelyn stood beside him, calm and resolute. Her braid draped over her shoulder, her white dress streaked with the dust of the street, yet shining with an ethereal dignity. For a long moment, the town held its breath. Silence stretched across the boardwalks, wooden storefronts, and porches. Everyone knew that today, the heart of Dry Creek would change forever. Then, Evelyn stepped forward. "Silas," she said softly, her voice carrying across the street, "you have faced your pride, your anger, and your sorrow. You have seen what fear cannot accomplish and what truth and courage can." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the assembled townsfolk. "You may rise again, but you must do so with humility. Only then will the town and yourself truly heal." Silas's jaw tightened. He lowered his head, the weight of realization pressing heavily on his shoulders. I understand," he whispered, voice cracked and raw. "I have been blind, but I see now. I will not let pride dictate my actions again. I will do right by this town." Tahkeel stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Silas's shoulder. The gesture was firm, grounding, a silent acknowledgment of the man's choice to accept responsibility. "Then the past is settled, and the future begins. But remember, Silas Ward, the strength of a man is measured not by fear, but by the courage to face himself and his consequences." Silas nodded slowly, the last traces of stubborn pride giving way to a solemn, quiet humility. He looked out over the street, taking in the townsfolk who had gathered, witnessing not just his fall, but his rise from it. Eyes that had once shown fear and resentment now reflected a cautious hope. Then Evelyn moved closer to Tahkeel, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. The townspeople noticed, whispers rippling through the crowd. Yet, it was not romance alone that drew their attention, it was the undeniable sense of moral authority, courage, and unity that both figures radiated. In their presence, the town felt safe, yet profoundly aware of the justice that had been served. Silas turned fully toward the crowd. "This town has endured much," he said, his voice stronger now, tempered by humility. "I have failed you, and for that I am deeply sorry. But I will work to restore trust, to make amends, and to honor what truly matters, our community, our lives, and the principles we all hold dear." A murmur of approval ran through the town. Mothers relaxed their grip on shawls, fathers straightened in acknowledgement, and even the usually stern sheriff nodded slightly. Dry Creek had witnessed a transformation not just of one man, but of the town itself. Tahkeel's eyes met Evelyn's briefly, a silent exchange of recognition and shared strength. Then, slowly, he turned to the street, scanning the town with a watchful, protective gaze. It was clear to everyone that he was not only a warrior but a guardian of justice. Calm in presence yet fierce when needed, Evelyn stepped forward, embracing Tahkeel in front of Silas. The gesture was public, symbolic, and unyielding. Silas's face, though sorrowful, reflected acceptance rather than rage. He had been humbled, yet he understood the truth of her actions, some connections, some strength, could not be denied that the townsfolk watched in silence, the sorrow and tension of the previous days giving way to a cautious sense of hope. Dry Creek had been tested, and through courage, humility, and unshakable moral authority, it had survived and perhaps even thrived. As the sun rose fully over the dusty streets, casting long, golden rays across the town, the wind carried a sense of closure. The story of pride, sorrow, and reckoning had reached its end. Silas Ward would carry the lessons of this ordeal. Evelyn and Tahkeel would continue as symbols of strength and justice. And the town of Dry Creek would remember the day when hearts were tested. Pride was humbled and truth prevailed.